The question of whether God can sin touches on deep theological and philosophical concepts regarding the nature of God's holiness, omnipotence, and morality. In most major religious traditions, particularly in Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, God is considered to be perfect, holy, and incapable of sin. Here's how this question is typically approached. 1. God's nature is perfect and holy. In Christian theology, for example, God is understood to be perfectly good, righteous, and holy. Sin, by definition, is the violation of God's will or the falling short of his moral perfection. Since God is morally perfect and his nature is the standard of what is good, he cannot sin. Sin, in this view, is incompatible with God's nature. In the Bible, it is written that God is light. In him, there is no darkness at all. 1 John 1:5, meaning that God cannot engage in anything that would contradict his own perfect holiness. 2. Omnipotence and logical consistency. Some people may ask, if God is omnipotent, doesn't that mean he can do anything, even sin, while God is omnipotent, all-powerful? Omnipotence is often understood as the power to do all things that are logically possible. Since sin is a moral contradiction and a corruption of perfection, it is not seen as something that is logically possible for a perfect being. The idea is that God's perfection and holiness makes sin logically impossible for him. Not that God lacks the power to sin, but that sin is not part of his nature. 3. God's will and moral perfection. In traditional monotheistic theology, God is believed to always act in accordance with his will, which is always perfectly good. This means that sin, which is seen as a rebellion or turning away from God's will, cannot be part of God's nature. Sin, in this sense, is seen as an act of disobedience or moral failure, neither of which applies to a perfectly holy and just God. 4. Philosophical interpretation. Some philosophers have suggested that the question itself is based on a misunderstanding of God's nature. Rather than seeing sin as something that could be part of God's will, it might be better understood as a concept that is inherently incompatible with God's essence. Sin is a corruption of the good, but God, being all good, cannot experience or choose to engage in such corruption. 5. Jesus' sinlessness. In Christianity, the sinlessness of Jesus is a key doctrine. Even though Jesus took on human nature, he is still believed to be fully God and fully human. The fact that Jesus lived a sinless life is seen as an affirmation that God cannot sin, even when he took on human form. In summary, most theological traditions assert that God cannot sin because sin is contrary to his perfect nature. It's not about a lack of power, but rather about sin being an inherent contradiction to God's inherent goodness and holiness.